everybody for joining. I appreciate everybody jumping in. Obviously today was the day that we were supposed to realize several new forms in our zip forms library. But because of circumstances, many things have been delayed as a result of it. So we're going to talk a little bit about that this morning and kind of what you guys can anticipate. I also wanted to add and bake in plenty of time for Q&A and discussion about how we communicate with both our buyers and our sellers throughout this. I know many of you have reached out to me individually to kind of get a gauge on what is the language that we all want to center around and rally towards, but we can talk about that today towards the end of this presentation. So we've got plenty of time for Q&A, and that was deliberate. So as we get started, I say this every time. You guys, first of all, those of you who don't know me, my name's D. Wilmore. I am the head of brokerage here at Radius. So if you haven't met me before, definitely take some time to meet me and just say hello. But I always like to start these off with a quote. And in this case, all of you, whether you've been in real estate a day, a year, a week, like 10 years or longer, change is inevitable. And we haven't seen this level of change in about 14 years, give or take. And then prior to that, it was another 10 years before we saw massive change. But the landscape of real estate as a whole is changing, both from a technological perspective as well as a form and function perspective. And right now, because we've been embroiled in this battle of how we get paid and who pays what and all that, that's a significant change. But I've mentioned before, this is not the first time out for the National Association of Realtors. There's 4 times specifically that I can think of dating back to 1950 over this same type of matter. So how does it impact us now? So I always like to start these things off with a quote. I'm a big fan of quotes. I think quotes are centered in reality and based on people's experience, and they're meant to be motivational or at least revealing. So the quote for today is, "Growth and comfort do not coexist. Change is inevitable. Growth is optional." And where I took from this quote this morning is specifically, some of us can choose to kind of stay in yesterday, and some of us can roll with the change and really kind of upsell ourselves in our business models. The one thing that I can tell all of you, and many of you, I've had this discussion, you're going to see quite a bit of contraction from a licensee standpoint in real estate over the next 12 to 18 months. You're going to have folks who naturally get out of business. Historically, first-time realtors, will be out of the business in 2 years if they don't have sales within their first year. That's not my statistic. That's just the statistic of NAR. But because of all this change, you're going to see brokerages and agents alike kind of disappear as a result of the changes. Some who are unequipped or under-equipped to deal with this level of change. Some don't have the skills to actually negotiate with their customer base in order to create a thriving business. Some are going to age out. Some are going to elect to no longer be participants in the National Association of Realtors, which is actually the 3rd largest lobbying organization in the United States. People have asked me, where are we positioned here at Radius? At Radius at this time, I see no functional reason for us not to be a member of the National Association of Realtors and its subsequent state boards. So we will continue with our relationships with the National Association of Realtors and the California Association of Realtors for this group, just for form and function. And again, there's lots of benefits that we continue to see as an organization. Because I mentioned the fact that this is not the first time out for NAR, there's a lot of small intrinsic things that I think are important to us to maintain as a company. So there's that. And is my slides out of order? So let's talk a bit about what's actually going on. So the Department of Justice has launched a formal inquiry into C.A.R specifically about the issuance of standard forms and some of the new forms that surround compensation. They're concerned about potential irregularities in the process. And we've talked about that in previous meetings. There's no way you can change a whole bank of forms without something breaking. In this case, there were 74 forms that were in revision. 69 of them were critical revisions, and 26 revolved around compensation and the changes to the documentation around compensation, which is where I think the Department of Justice is actually ringing the bell. They're saying, wait a minute, these forms are great, but they feel like a Band-Aid. And even though the California Association of Realtors has not disclosed any specifics around the inquiry from the Department of Justice, one can surmise that it has to do with I've looked at all the forms. I was going to use the word vagueness. I think that a lot of the forms still feel open to interpretation. That's my own personal judgment to that. That's nothing that's official from the California Association of Realtors. But if I were to look at them logically as I have, I think some of the language is still open to interpretation, which is what I'll share. But either way, the Department of Justice has definitely got its tentacles in California Association of Realtors. California Association of Realtors is the second largest realtor association in the United States. So we're pretty big considering the size of us as a state, right? We're about 40 million strong. So it would make sense that we'd have such a huge association. But again, the Department of Justice has some significant questions. And because of those questions, the California Association of Realtors has decided to delay the release of many of its forms that were scheduled to roll out today until potentially August 12th or August 13th. So I want to talk about that a little bit. MLSs are continually working to update their systems, their forms, and their member resources. Again, this is a Herculean task, guys. Most form committees, the form committee meets and distributes new forms almost every June. June and December has been the normal cadence for as long as I can remember for forms releases. But because of the introduction to new forms and the revision of existing forms to address issues surrounding the compensation rules, it's a lot to actually put into in terms of mainstream play. So I think that has a little bit to do with it. I mentioned C.A.R is the nation's second largest association. So the Department of Justice, we're really the gold standard. We're the benchmark. We're the leaders across the United States in terms of what boards will do, which is why I think the Department of Justice has specifically targeted C.A.R's forms specifically. And we've had the most revisions out of every state, at least. Yeah, I believe we've had the most revisions out of any state. So that's fairly significant as well. So, come on. There we go. So why is the Department of Justice so interested in C.A.R? The Department of Justice has been critical over the rules and policies, and they've argued since the settlement language started to happen that policy changes don't go far enough to eliminate the anti-competitive practices, which was part of the core, or one of the fundamental reasons for the lawsuits to begin with. And again, these are years old. So the Department of Justice still feels as though there's not enough being done in order to facilitate true change in the industry. As a matter of fact, post-settlement around April, the Department of Justice had petitioned the courts to say, hey, can we continue to investigate this? We don't feel that this is beneficial to consumers in any way, or at least not to the lengths in which we hoped it would be. So we'd like to continue to investigate and ask for adjustments if necessary. Okay, so that's part of the reason why we're seeing such a delay in this. The agency also suggested, meaning the Department of Justice, also suggested that rules should prohibit sellers from offering any compensation to buyers' agents. Again, as we look at what the core, the basis of the lawsuit was, sellers felt as though they had no choice, no option to not pay a buyer's representative. And, you know, just because it's been historic or just because that's what's always been done, they feel like that's what's done a disservice to sellers. And on the flip side of that, there are many buyer lawsuits in play, whereas buyers feel like they never got a seat at the table. And so for that reason, they're saying, hey, wait a minute, we shouldn't agree to this settlement so quickly because none of these things address what our concerns are as buyers. You know, some of these lawsuits claim that buyers would have never paid their agents as much as what they were asking as a result of the services that were delivered or the quality of services that were delivered. So there's a lot. And, you know, if I'm going to be honest, guys, a lot of this has to do with, you know, anytime that it's like chum in the water, you know, sharks are going to circle. Anytime there's a smell of blood, or in this case, where there's money that can be had. And in the seller lawsuits, you're talking about close to $1 billion. You know, people are going to, you know, want to get a piece of that pie. So I've actually had an opportunity to read some of the cases for the buyer lawsuits. I'm not an attorney, nor am I a legal expert in any way. You know, I do have some common sense and logic to me, but a lot of these lawsuits do feel relatively toothless. They feel like they're without teeth, without real bite. But again, sometimes it's the little nuances that sink a ship, right? So we want to be cautious in terms of what that looks like. We all know that MLSs will no longer be able to display compensation for a listing anywhere in the NMLS, or in the NMLS, I'm thinking mortgage, in the MLS. And that also means there can be no pointers. In other words, you can't have a link to something in the MLS. Now, I know that a lot of people feel differently about this. And again, this is subject to interpretation. But the common language is we can't have any mention of compensation in the MLS. Now, there's compensation and there's concession. Many of you have reached out to me and talked to me about concession and what does that mean when a seller can concess. You know, a seller technically can concess up to the amount of what a buyer representative's compensation may look like, but they cannot mention that concession is specifically for a buyer's representative's compensation. Also with the pointers, like you put a link to your website that may have a mention of compensation, that's clearly a no-no, even though I've heard other people say, oh, you can do that. You really can't. And I think that's where there's points of confusion. You've got some MLSs which are independent MLSs. You've got some MLSs which are association MLSs. The bulk are actually association MLSs, but there's a subtle conflict. And again, it's that understanding of what's actually being stated. So some feel like you should be able to put some kind of link, but the core of it is you can't. Any form of compensation, and that includes any kind of directional link that would expressly state what's being offered. So these are problematic right now, which is kind of what's creating some of this delay. And then C.A.R didn't, as I said, C.A.R didn't really indicate what the big concerns were, but the 21 forms, which we'll discuss briefly today, leads me to believe it has a lot to do with kind of what I'm sharing with you right now. Okay. Come on, click through. Welcome to technology. So let's talk a little bit about the forms release timeline. All of the forms should be released by August 17th. Many of the MLSs will be releasing their forms by the 12th of August to be live that following morning, which is Tuesday, August 13th. Some MLSs are kind of going to do their own thing. So is there uniformity? No. Are people going to try to introduce this uniformly? That's a maybe, right? Many of you belong to multiple MLSs, and each one kind of has its own sets of rules and guidelines. So everybody's scrambling for that. And it also has a lot to do with revenue for them as well, which is sad but true. So we will align with C.A.R regarding the use of the BRBC, the Buyer Broker Representative Form, until its amended release. Part of it is I really want everybody to be able to develop some muscle memory around this. Many of you have approached me and talked about, you know, I've never used one of those. What is this actually going to mean? How is my buyer going to be able to do these things? But the more we start to get very familiar with how we want to structure our conversations and how we want to create language around this so buyers have a full understanding, and it'll minimize your challenges and your skill set in regards of objection handling. I think it's wise that we continue to utilize the buyer broker buyer compensation agreement, even though it's not fully amended yet. And we'll continue to utilize that even once it's amended, is to give you guys a running start at this thing. Again, this is a bit challenging. Many of you have never been in the position to negotiate your compensation with a buyer before. Most of us haven't, right? I mean, if you've done commercial or anything like that, it's old hat. I've done lots of commercials, so I'm familiar with negotiating for compensation, but you're also talking about a different body to where there's no emotion that's usually involved. With a buyer who already may be marginal, these things could be a challenge, right? Somebody's already pulling every nickel they can, including mattress money, to make sure they can, you know, secure a purchase. Now we're being asked, you know, to have them compensate us as well. That's a difficult process. In the very near future, meaning all through the month of July, we're going to have several rooms in regards to scripting on how to work successfully with both your buyers and your sellers, so that you're using the right language and exercising the right language cues. A lot of it has to do with giving information in advance as to what someone can expect, right? It's always management of expectation when it comes to any kind of successful sales. You want to make sure everybody's aligned with what next steps are so they don't have questions during the process. So that's why we're going to still require that you utilize the buyer broker agreement. And what does that mean? That means that this thing has to go out or has to be signed by your buyer in advance of you showing them a property. I know some of you are going to give a little pushback and say, well, wait a minute, it's not required yet. You know, yes, it's not officially required yet, but it will be. So again, getting in the habit, getting into practice. Brandon and I were just talking about tennis earlier. You know, just because he's hitting balls against the wall and not a component doesn't mean he's not training for tennis, right? He's absolutely perfecting his stroke and, you know, getting where he wants his shots to be positioned and all that. And in essence, this is the same process, okay? So we will require that agents who are working with a buyer enter into the written agreement before the buyer tours the home with the following conditions. The written agreement must conspicuously disclose the amount or rate of compensation to be received, regardless of the source, and how this amount will be determined, okay? It can't be open-ended on these agreements. I've seen a couple of agreements come across my desk already that says, you know, if or TBD, things like that. It has to be expressly stated. Buyer will compensate me 3%. Buyer will pay me 15,000, you know, whatever it is. And there are two sections for that. Keep in mind that the buyer broker agreement, or the buyer representation, a broker compensation agreement, which is its formal title, actually addresses two sections. One, which is the agreement itself by default, is non-exclusive, right? There's a checkbox on that document that will make it exclusive. What I mean by that is just having a buyer sign it doesn't bind them to you. There's a checkbox on the document itself that you want it to be exclusive. In other words, you want them to work expressly with you for a period of time, okay? So you want to make sure you check that. These agreements are only good for 3-month clips anyway, right? You can only work with a buyer effectively for a period of 3 months as a result of this document. And part of that was done in advance of beginning January 1, 2025, all listing agreements max out at a period of 2 years. So this coincides with what those changes are as well, okay? The agent cannot be compensated for more than the amount that's stated in the buyer representation agreement, regardless of the source. So many of you have asked me, well, what if I get 2% from the buyer and 3% from the seller? If it says 2% on the buyer representation broker compensation document, that's all you can be compensated, period, is 2%. Period. Does that make sense to everybody? That is your max. You are capped out at that 2%. Okay, there's no wiggle room. There's nothing like it. And the other question that I'll address, which I didn't put into a slide, which is how is anybody going to know, right? Our industry is largely self-regulated. There's not enough oversight as a whole. There's not enough bodies. There's not enough regulators to actually oversee everything that we do, which is why you have brokers, which is why we look at each other. We're self-policing in that regards. And so the same is true in the I got you, Donna. The same is true in the enforcement of the buyer representation broker compensation form. So it's self-regulating, but the MLS is the one who is ultimately in charge. And why this is so critical is if there are egregious violations, that can reopen the door to these lawsuits, okay, which is probably not the best thing we want to see happen. So I'm sure most MLSs will put out some edict about self-policing, about the governance of what this process is going to look like. I'm sure there's going to be a grace period out of the gate, which is first infraction, shame on you, don't do it again, but we're going to be watching you. Second infraction may be monetized in some way, and probably further occurrences may result up to you being suspended or ejected from the local multiple listing service. Donna, quick question.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the reverse is also true, or if we buyer broker agreement says an amount that's higher than the seller's willing to pay. Can our buyer make up that difference?
I don't want to speculate because, I could say that makes sense, but, the changes that may be proposed as a result of the Department of Justice may, prohibit that altogether. So I can't effectively speak to that, but, I clearly understand the sentiment behind that question. Okay, come on. How many times do I got to click this thing? There we go. All right. So the forms that are delayed on the list side, the residential listing agreement, that's a form that's delayed. Again, they removed, as I saw these forms when they were red lettered, they removed all mention of compensation to a buyer representative and replaced it with something else. Initially, when I saw the red letter document, it had, if the seller chooses to, and then it really delineated and defined what that should look like. And again, in the hopes of full transparency, keep in mind any compensation that is offered to a buyer representative must be disclosed to the seller as well, even if it's the buyer who's paying for it. Okay. Don't ask me fully why. I think I understand why, but we're talking about transparency, and the goal is to be completely transparent. Same with the go ahead, Jazz.
Eddie, so yeah, a quick follow-up on that. So when you say that the commission agreement between the buyer and the agent has to be shared with the compensation has to be shared with the seller, that could become a very crucial information to even acceptance of an offer. Let's say there are two offers on the table for the seller for the exact same price, and the one agent has a 2.5% agreement with the agent, and the other one has, let's say, 1.5.
Gotcha.
That basically spoils the offer, right?
Jazz, I know exactly what you're saying, but let me say two things around that. First of all, we have a fiduciary obligation, period. Which means we need to do what's in the best interest of our customer. irrespective of compensation, right? Which is why it's critical that once you guys get into conversation that's less than casual, you complete an agency disclosure, a disclosure of agency relationships, as well as the BRBC. Many of us don't recognize when we become less than casual, and I'm going to address your point in just a second, Jazz. Many of us don't realize when we've become less than casual and we've engaged our professional licenses. Keep in mind, anything we say, guys, is not a matter of opinion. Because we are all licensed, we hold weight. So it becomes critical, everything we say. So when we're doling out information. So Jazz, to your point, you're saying that, first of all, someone could direct the fact that, oh, this is only paying X in terms of compensation, and this person is asking for this. The truth of the matter is any kind of steering in that regards is a crime. It's illegal, meaning it's punishable by a $10,000 fine and up to a year in jail.
No,
So,
maybe there was some kind of miscommunication. What I'm trying to say is for the sellers to decide on accepting an offer. So let's say they get two offers from two different agents, right? And they have information about what is the compensation agreement between the buyer and the agent, right? So on one of them, it is 2.5%. At the other one, there's only 1.5%. Now the seller has that information. The offers are exactly the same. So now, in order to net more money, he would of course go with the buyer who's agent who's only getting 1.5%. So that he has to pay 1% less.
Okay,
He already has all that information.
We're saying the same thing. I understand what you're saying, but that's still a type of steering, right? Based on the licensee's compensation, and that's exactly what I was sharing with you. Is there's boundaries in the laws that would prohibit that. But let's not speculate right now, Jazz. I get where you're at, from a point perspective, but that's a pretty heady subject that none of us have any control over in terms of what the mandate will look like, right? I do know at this point in time, transparency is the key based on the settlement, which means that the seller needs to be aware of what the compensation is going to be to the buyer's representative. Okay. So, we could all go back and forth on what that means and, why that is or isn't effective or any of the above. But, based on the settlement, the language is the seller needs to be made aware of what the buyer's representative compensation is going to look like, either upfront, on the back end, in the middle. That's the question, right? And what you're talking about is at the table versus in the midst of the transaction. So we can discuss that at a later time. But totally get what you're saying, Jazz. The residential listing seller reserve form is something that's going to be delayed. The commercial residential income listing agreement is going to be delayed. Gotcha, James. Let me get through this and I'll take your question. The vacant land listing agreement is going to be delayed. The lease listing agreement is going to be delayed. And all of these, again, have references to the compensation of the buyer representative. And so this is why there is significant delay to these forms. And also the modification of terms, the listing agreement, that will also be delayed. Yes, James.
Can you just confirm something for us real quick? So are you saying, or is the law saying that even if the buyer is agreeing to pay buyer's agent's compensation, it still needs to be disclosed to the seller?
That is correct, yes.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep, 100%. Thanks for that. And then also the open house non-agency disclosure, that will also be delayed. As I looked at the form, and I shared this in a previous class, that form just on its face, at least for me, appears problematic. And that is open to lots of interpretation on that form. And, so I shared that in a class a couple of weeks ago. So I can see definitely why that one was delayed. And by the way, this delay does not mean that any of these forms won't move forward. It just means that additional revisions may be possible for these forms in order for them to be fully in play. Okay. On the buy side, the forms that are going to be delayed on the buy side are the buyer broker buyer compensation agreement. Again, it's a non-exclusive form if that checkbox is not checked and initialed. Again, the language is, some of the language at its face may be open for interpretation. The original form was drafted back in 22 and released in 12 of 22. So there's several areas that are interconnected with lots of forms that need to be adjusted or amended. The buyer identification and preferences and priorities, that form is being revised or being delayed. The buyer financial and personal information is being delayed. The ABCD, the anticipated broker compensation disclosure, is being delayed. And the cancellation of buyer representation is being delayed. The notice of broker involved properties is being delayed, and also the modification of terms for the buyer representation agreement is being delayed. So all of these forms are being delayed. These were all scheduled to be live as of today. I don't know how long the delay is. I do know that they could go all the way up until August 12th or 13th. Barring that there's no other issues that need to be addressed, but this is what we can look forward to. Again, we're going to recommend that you continue to use the buyer representation broker compensation agreement, even in its present state, until until the amended version comes out. That's going to give you guys a lot more talking points. It's critical that you guys know what the language is in these forms anyway. I would use these like, you're reading the newspaper or, something to that nature, to where you want to be familiar with the content of these documents, because any document will give you accurate talking clues, talking cues when you're working with your buyers and your sellers. So you want to make sure you familiarize yourself with the language of these forms. A lot of you, I'm sure all of you, are familiar with Mel, our AI. Leverage Mel as much as possible. Ask Mel questions about what to say based on specific language. Of course, you can always ask me, but utilize Mel, utilize the tools that we have at hand, because that's why we built them, for your use completely. Lila, what's your question?
Hey Dee, I was curious. I know you mentioned the buyer agent compensation in the contract has to be specific. Would it be considered specific if, for example, for a seller present or listing contract?
We're talking about a buyer, right?
I'm sorry?
We're talking about a buyer, right? You mentioned the seller, so I just wanted to make sure I understood where you were going.
Yeah, we're talking about a buyer, but for the seller side, sometimes the compensation conversation lands on a range. So if the home sells for this amount, then it's 5%. If it's this amount, it's 5.5%. Is that?
You're talking about what's called a dual variable, which would exist on the residential listing side. If I'm not mistaken, I believe you're asking me, will that dual variable still exist, and how would that be reported from the buy side? Is that where you're getting at?
Like a buyer version of that.
There is no buy version of that. It has to be explicit. So on the buy side, there is no range. If the home sells for X, then I'll be compensated X. It is flat out specific. It's going to be 2%, 3%, 1%, or $5,000, $20,000, $15,000. The exact amount of compensation has to be specified. There is no range. And I suspect that's going to change that range volume, or that dual variable, on the list side as well.
Got it. Thank you.
Did I get to your question?
Yes, it did.
Okay, cool. All right, let's see. All right, there are some mutual forms that are also delayed. The broker compensation advisory, which is going to be delayed. And again, that kind of really relates to all of the other forms mentioned. The limited property representation broker compensation agreement, which was essentially a one-time agreement kind of a thing to show a buyer a specific property. That's going to be adjusted. This falls kind of in line with the whole open house non-agency agreement. There's some really crazy language in that you just kind of go, I know what it means, but would I immediately know what it means? You know, so that's being delayed. The cooperating broker compensation agreement and escrow instructions is also being delayed, and the seller payment to buyer's broker is going to be delayed. Again, all this language is very vague, and some of it is subject to interpretation. I'm not an attorney. Again, it may be just vague to me. I'm old and stupid, so who knows? But, you know, I doubt if that's fully the case. So they want to make sure that there are no issues overall. Okay. And some resources for you guys to where you can do a little bit more digging, and then also find some resources into how to communicate with your customer base, be it a buyer or a seller. You've got the broker compensation compliance page at the California Association of Realtors.org site. You may want to go to that. There's lots of resources on that page that you can access, and actually lots of downloadable information that you can share with your sellers or your buyers. And then Smart Zone, which is more designed for the buyer's representative, resources to share with your buyers, or at least get some talking cues and things like that for your customer base. Guys, now is the time really to up level your business. We started this off, and I got you, Lucy. We started this off with the quote about change. You know, change is inevitable. Growth is optional. You guys can look at, you know, your business models and say, I choose to grow along with the industry that I've chosen, or, you know, I'm going to stay strong in what I've always done and hope for the best, right? Change is inevitable. Many of us need to really kind of beef ourselves up in regards to our scripting language, how we handle objections, what we can anticipate the objections may be. One thing throughout my entire career that I've realized is if I can mitigate an objection before it hits my plate, then it goes much smoother, and I have a better opportunity of success in terms of either working with that customer or securing that listing. So those are some of the things that you may want to consider as you look at your business model. Lucy, question for you.
Hello, hi.
Hey.
My question is pretty much for the future, but it's still coming already, and it's very close future. So I want to ask, what happens to those listings that we already have, and they're actually advertised with a buyer commission as well currently,
Mm-hmm.
and pretty standard commission, and
Mm-hmm.
then we're getting an offer and ready to get into an escrow, or we already in escrow,
Yep.
and around that time that is changing happening. How are we handling this paperwork? Are we rearranging it? Are we what's going to happen to my offers?
Gotcha. So that's what the modification of terms were for. There are a couple of forms in that form set that I just shared with you that were meant to address those changes. So if you're, you know, if your legacy, if you were pre the institution of the settlement terms, then it would be simply a modification of terms or a couple of those other forms that were mentioned. But since those forms are delayed, and the fact that these more than likely won't go into effect until August, you have some time. If you find that your escrows are extended beyond, let's say, the 10th of August, then we'll review those with you to make sure, and then the modification of terms, if it's live by that time, will go out to amend the language that was customary to the practice that we're in now.
I wanted to actually understand one more thing. Like, I have a seller
Mm-hmm.
who knows obviously that this whole change is coming.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, my seller, I have a feeling, because of the conversations that we had together, I have a feeling my seller is delaying this whole thing. Whatever offer we're getting, she's like trying to push it. And my feeling is that she's pushing it until this whole law gets into effect, and then finally she will be released from the paying buyer agent as well. You know what I mean? So that's my feeling that I have from her. And I'm kind of like scared that once we're in escrow, or we're ready to get in escrow, and this whole rule comes in, and then she starts making a big deal of finally not paying the other side, and then that will become a problem. How do I actually even negotiate with her not to
Gotcha.
even consider that?
Gotcha. So you know, and Jazz just referenced it, you know, keep in mind that at this time, you know, what's ever written in the contract is valid in the contract. But what I would suggest is this, is that we need to start having conversations with our customers right now so that there's a clear understanding, right? We're the ones who control that narrative. You know, at the end of the day, that's the truth in any kind of sales dialogue, is we control that narrative. And if we can start to have preemptive conversations around Mr. and Mrs. Seller, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I know you are probably aware of the changes in our industry, and I wanted to have an opportunity to explain to you what those changes mean, right? All consumers think they have information, and that's been historic, right? Everybody thinks they know how real estate works. Everybody you meet, walk out into the street right now and ask 10 people, they'll all tell you what they think real estate is and how it works. We know differently, right? And the same is true with these changes. As a matter of fact, when this was first announced that NAR was not successful in the lawsuit, the New York Times immediately published, like the next day, NAR, you know, was found guilty of overcharging its customers, which wasn't what was going on at all. But again, once it's in the public lexicon, they believe that to be true. And because we are the practitioners, because we are the disseminators of information, we need to make sure the information is correct. It's just like when you go to your doctor, right? I may have seen a drug ad on television and think I have all these symptoms, but the reality is my physician is the professional, and they're going to say, you're crazy. It's all in your head. Dude, you don't have this. You don't need Ozempic, or you don't need any of these other things, right? But drug companies have the mission of selling their drug. So consumers believe what's, you know, being given to them. And the same is true in our industry. So if we don't correct the inaccurate perceptions of what's actually going on, it's going to be a much harder conversation with our customer base.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Other questions, guys? I know this was short and sweet and a lot to take in, but I wanted to make sure you guys had all the current. Brandon, go ahead. And then Lucy, I'll come back to you.
Okay, thanks. I missed part of this presentation. Maybe you already addressed it. The challenge, I think, is, for me anyway, in open houses, and the unrepresented buyer that walks in the door. It's an interesting comment from NAR the other day. They said, well, listen, you're not hired as bouncers. But, and that nothing was clear after that. I said, okay, I'm glad I'm not a bouncer now. But, so what is the protocol for a listing agent that's doing the open house, and also versus a non-listing agent doing an open house? And the question came up like, okay, the person comes in and says, what, are you kidding me? You're not going to let me come in? You want me to sign a piece of paper?
Yep. There was that document that was scheduled to come out today, the open house non-agency agreement, to where the practitioner was asking, hey, are you represented, right? I mean, the job is mandatorily, our fiduciary responsibility is with the seller if we're the listing agent. So we have no agency authority over the buyer, or a proposed agency authority over a prospect who comes in the door. So we have to let them know up front, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, potential buyer, I represent the seller exclusively. Are you working with someone? You know, if I were to represent you, this is what it would look like. It would look like a dual agency. In other words, I have fiduciary to both. That was kind of the proposal of that open house language. And by the way, we should probably always be doing something similar to the language that I just shared. But, you know, Brandon, that's a good question, because going forward, I need to see what the revision on the proposed forms is going to look like before I actually give you an answer. But as it sat that as someone came in, we were actually having them sign that form that says, hey, I represent the seller. If you're seeking representation, or if you're working with someone else, these are the steps in making that happen. And then it also gave us authority to show that prospective buyer one additional property, in addition to the house that we are holding open. There's that appears to all be changing, but I don't know what the final document would look like. But, you know, in answer to your question, yeah, we're probably going to be forced to, or at least mandated to, have prospective people come into an open house, sign a document that says, I represent the seller exclusively. There's a potential I could represent you, but I don't represent you at that time. So any information would any additional information would need to be shared with your representative. That's
Okay.
essentially kind of.
Perfect. And on the other side, it's a non-listing agent doing an open house.
Sorry about that, everybody. My network tweaked on me. Everybody still with me?
Yep. We're all
Yep.
good.
Okay, Lucy, you had a question, and then Donna.
That's okay. I just wanted to know if we can get the transcripts, recording or something of this
Yeah,
conversation.
Ela will share that out with you along with any materials that are associated with this today.
Yeah, thank you. Perfect. Thank you.
Donna? Donna,
Yeah.
you still with me?
I am. So I read a fact sheet. I think I got it from the NAR. It's either the NAR website or the C.A.R website.
NAR website.
Yeah. So, and what it said basically was if you have an open house and somebody comes in and refuses to sign anything, you can hand them your listing sheet or whatever and let them tour. You don't have to kick them out or anything like that. So there's
Right.
at least that if they stick with
Oh,
it.
yeah. Based on the bouncer conversation that Brandon had. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me see your ID. You're not 21. Get the heck out of here.
Yeah.
That'd be fun. Other questions, guys? I want to make sure that we have some good takeaways from this and that I'm not leaving any unanswered questions. Everybody good?
We're good. Thank you.
Everybody can quote the BRBC to me tomorrow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, as always, guys, I really appreciate the time that you guys have taken to spend with me. Don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions. There will be a recorded version of this contract. Yes, Rasha used the old forms. But if you have any questions in between now and then, don't hesitate to reach out and stay tuned. This will all be shared with you guys. There'll be other classes regarding this, so I want to make sure you guys are fully aware as we move forward. But thanks for your time today, and go ahead, Ela, take it away.
I was just going to say that we will be conducting another forms update class likely next week. And so for California specifically. So I will send out some communications regarding that, but feel free to stay tuned.
Awesome.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so
Take care,
much.
all.
Thank you so much.